Well, thank you everyone for being with us. This Sunday, the last Sunday of the year, and as always on the last Sunday of the year, our theme is peace. And you'll notice that in the email I sent out and in the tagline to the email that this isn't the human idea of peace. This is the peace that passes understanding. This is the spiritual concept of peace that we're going to be talking about today. So I want to thank Jeannie for sending me an email to remind me of the World Peace Meditation, also called the World Healing Meditation, which takes place on the 31st of December every year at noon Greenwich time, which is 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This was started by John Randolph Price many years ago, part of his Quartus, Q-U-A-R-T-U-S, Quartus Foundation. So if you'd like some information on that, I put the link in the email, and you can just do an internet search for John Randolph Price World Healing Day, and it will pop right up. And there's a very nice prayer for peace there that people can use. And the idea then is that at noon Greenwich time, that is the only moment that the entire planet is on the same day. Right? So if it's a second before or a second after, half of the planet is today, and the other half of the planet is tomorrow or yesterday, I guess, depending upon where you are. But at noon, it's a unity. It's noon, it's a singularity. And at that time, people from all over the world come together to engage in their spiritual practice. Some will simply read the prayer that they have put forward. Some will engage in their own prayers, their own meditations, chants, whatever their spiritual practice happens to be, for the purpose of experiencing peace here, now, on this earth. And it's a beautiful experience. When we lived in Wilmington, we used to go to the beach at sunrise. At 7 a.m. on December 31st. It's just about sunrise. And in fact, if you get the emails, that picture that's included in the email, that was taken during one of the World Peace Meditations down at Carolina Beach. But the feeling that you get, no matter where you are, you can do this. And we started doing this in Denver in the 80s. It just seems that you tap into this wave, this wave of emotion, this wave of feeling, this wave of peace. And during one of those meditations back in the 80s, as I was sitting there, of course, that was 5 a.m. in Denver. You really had to be dedicated to get up. But Lori and I were sitting there, and this feeling of being part of something so much bigger, of feeling this energy of peace as it was kind of circulating the globe. And in that moment, I had a vision, or an imagination, if you want to call it that. I could see in my mind's eye. But what I was envisioning when I was thinking of peace, I saw the Berlin Wall coming down. I saw holes in the wall. I saw people walking through the holes in the wall and shaking hands with one another, people from either side of the wall. And that was, of course, a few years before it actually happened. So it's just something special. There's just something wonderful about it. And I invite everybody, if you can, no matter where you are, 7 a.m. December 31st, 7 a.m. Eastern Time, noon Greenwich Time. Pause for a few moments. Pause for a few moments to experience peace. So this topic of peace, it's something that we need to focus on. We need to spend time focusing on, what do we really mean by this? What does the world mean by peace, and what do we really mean by peace? And what is it? What are the obstacles to experiencing it? How do we remove those obstacles, and how do we go about experiencing it in our own lives? So you notice that we talk about the peace that passes understanding. And I know I've told you this before. When I was a young boy growing up as an altar boy, the Mass was in Latin. And the altar boy's job was to respond to the priest in Latin on behalf of the congregation. So the idea was that the congregation wouldn't necessarily know Latin, but the altar boys were trained in the call and response, and they represented the congregation. And there's one part of the Mass, and if you've ever listened to like Christmas Eve, if you've ever listened to the Mass from the Vatican, there's one part that the priest just says, Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum. And then the response to that is very alliterative, and it just had kind of a ring to it, and it's et cum spiritu tuo. And if you listen to the chants, you can hear the people singing it. Et cum spiritu tuo, just kind of rings a little bit, had a nice ring to it. And what that means is, Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum. What it means is the peace of the Lord, Domine, the peace of the Lord, be always with you. Sit semper, always with you. Vobiscum, with you. And the response is, and with your spirit also. And with your spirit also. And just those two little lines are very telling about where we're going with peace. It's kind of encapsulated right there if we can break it down, which is we're not talking about a truce. We're not talking about a cessation of hostilities. Right? We're not talking about the absence of war. As Spinoza said, there's more to peace than the absence of war. It's a way of life. It's a way of being. It's an isness. It's a suchness. It's an I amness. We're not talking about the idea of cessation of hostilities. We're not talking about the interval between wars. In our history, what is the time of peace? Well, you had a period between the First World War and the Second World War where it was at peace. We had a time, from the Civil War to the Spanish-American War, kind of peace. And of course, ever since the 60s, we have been engaged in perpetual war. We don't even know what that period of cessation is anymore. So the human idea is based on an external condition. The human idea seems to be that peace is something that occurs out there, and we can experience peace when all the conditions are right. So when the shooting stops in a war, then we can say, well, that's peace. Now we're experiencing peace. But are we really, or are we just experiencing a lull in the activities? Clearly we can see that World War II was just an extension of World War I, taking place, some 30 years apart, 20 years apart. We think in human terms that when everybody else does things our way, well, then that'll be peaceful. Just all they have to do is get their thinking right and come around to my way of thinking, do things the way that I want them done, go to the same church I go to, read the same books I go to, and all those things, and then we will have peace, or I will have peace. And this is a human idea of peace that it doesn't exist. It does not exist. Because even if we could get everybody to come around to our way of thinking, if you look at different groups that have tried to do that, they have schisms within, where they have falling outs, where people say, well, yeah, we agree on a lot of things, but you don't agree on this, and then we can't be together any longer. And they start to have splits amongst themselves. They go off into different groups. And then you have all of these groups of people who essentially started out the same, and now they're arguing with one another over some fine point of politics or theology or something. So the human concept of peace as being something that is external to us, that's something that is dependent upon the behavior of other people, dependent upon the conditions of the world, that idea of peace is not what we're talking about. The peace of the Lord, Pax Domini, the peace of the Lord. And the response to the call, the peace of the Lord be with you always, was, and with your spirit, and with your spirit. It wasn't with your body, it wasn't with your mind, it wasn't with your emotions. It was with your spirit. It was a spiritual concept of peace. Now, this is my read into what those two lines mean, and I'm sure that other people have written volumes on it. But this is my read in light of what we're talking about today. So what we're talking about today is this human concept of peace as being an absence of struggle or a sense of cooperation or everybody's doing it my way kind of idea of peace, which is not the peace we're talking about. We're moving into this spiritual concept of peace. The spiritual peace. With your spirit. With your spirit. So first we want to look at this peace as it exists in the divine experience. And then we want to look at the obstacles in the human experience. And I do want to point out that this conversation, this discussion about spiritual peace occurs after we have been talking about the mystical experience for the month of December. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that because true peace, the spiritual peace, it cannot exist until we begin to awaken to the presence of the divine within us and within all people. As long as we're still functioning on a totally human level, we'll never have that peace. We'll never have that peace. It's our spiritual awakening. And more than our spiritual awakening, it's our spiritual awakening followed by our continued spiritual practice, that opens that door for the peace that passes understanding. So we have to again go back to the idea that this experience of the presence and the activity of the divine within us, the mystical experience or the experience of cosmic consciousness, if that's what you want to call it, that this is not an intellectual exercise. It is not something that we can get to by logic and reason. It is not something that we can arrive at through a mathematical formula. It is that which is beyond thoughts, but from which thoughts come. Beyond words, but from which words come. In our culture, we've grown up and we frequently would say, well, that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-presence. And that's probably as close as our intellect can come to trying to understand that which is understandable, that which is unknowable. But even that description is limited because God is not those things. God is expressing itself as those things. So even beyond this idea of all-knowing, there's consciousness. Even beyond this idea of all-powerful, there is the isness or the suchness that is expressing itself as all-power. Even beyond the idea that all presence is the presence of the divine. Even beyond as it comes into self-expression, it simply is. It simply is. So in that isness, in that suchness, in that I amness, you see, in the different teachings of the world, kind of saying the same thing, but saying it with slightly different terms. So in Old Testament Judaism, it was I am. I am. I am was the highest name for God. In Buddhism, we might get the isness or the suchness. In Hinduism, we might get that which is. And we might get the corollary, which is neti neti, not this, not that. Just simply that which is, that which is. So if we can somehow bring ourselves to begin to grasp this idea of isness or suchness or I amness or oneness or unity or singularity, then we recognize in that there is no other. There is no other. This is very important for our spiritual growth, is to understand that the divine does not have a sense of self and other. You and I have a sense of self and other. I'm me, you're you. I'm not you, you're not me. We kind of divide, see, and we separate. But the divine being one, being isness, being suchness, it doesn't have that sense of division. It doesn't have that sense of division. So in this way of existence, in this place of existence, of isness or suchness or I amness or of unity, there is no other. There just is. There just is. Then we have to ask ourselves, if there is no other, if there just is it possible for the divine to be against itself, to struggle against itself? What else is there? If there were any struggle, it would be God struggling against God. We say that goes against this intellectual idea of oneness, of unity, of I amness, of suchness. So there's no sense of struggle, you see. There's no sense of strain. There's no sense of argument or anger or those sorts of things. There just is. And in this existence of unity, this existence of oneness, or I amness, is perfect harmony. Because everything is part of itself and everything works together with each and every other part of itself. We don't have to go looking very far to see that. You know, if you look at the way that life manifests itself here on earth, and I'm not talking about where human consciousness has gone in and created an imbalance. I'm talking about in pure nature as it exists, there's a perfect harmony. The trees give off the oxygen that we need to breathe. We give off the carbon dioxide that they need to breathe. You know, the sun draws the water up out of the ocean, and it heats the land at a different rate than it heats the water, which gives us the wind that then moves the clouds back over the land, and we get the rain. And there's this cycle that we can see of life. We can see it as the scientists look back over the ages. You know, we can see that there's this perfect balance of life, that at times when we had too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to support life, life did something to remove that carbon dioxide. There's this balance. Life knows what to do. Life knows how to start the Arctic turn on their migration from South America back to the Arctic Circle. They lift off and they fly for 4,000 miles nonstop. And they arrive at Chesapeake Bay just as their main food source, the horseshoe crabs, as their eggs are hatching. What guides them on their way? What has created this timing but this perfect harmony of life? And even in a situation where we have predators and prey, you know, we can kind of step back and say, well, this is terrible. You know, these, for example, the wolves in Yellowstone Park. Human beings eradicated the wolves. We hunted them out because they were destroying the livestock. But since they've been reintroduced into Yellowstone Park, everything is getting stronger. The herds of the buffalo are getting stronger. Even the vegetation is changing. Even the banks of the streams are changing, because without the wolves, the animals would go right down to the bank and graze, and their paws would stir up the mud and create silt in the creek. And now that the wolves are there, the animals are more cautious and they stay back. And the banks of the creeks have been growing vegetation, and the silt is reduced, and the types of fishes that are there are changing. And all of life is supporting itself, even though from our point of view we say, oh, but the wolves are predators. Even in that relationship, there's a synergy. There's a harmony that goes beyond our understanding. So we come to this realization then that this thing that we call God is perfect harmony. It is perfect oneness. It is perfect life. And we would say it is perfect love, right? Because love is the experience of unity. Love is the experience of oneness. That which is perfect oneness is perfect love. And if you look at the scriptures, they will say, if you don't know God, you don't know love. And you have fear. So this divine idea of peace is more than an idea. The divine experience of peace already exists. Excuse me. It is already there. Whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not, whether we participate in it or not, it is. And it is unchanged or unfazed by us, because it is. It is. So some of the examples that we use, are the prism. You can hold a prism up to the light and you can get the colors of the rainbow, but there's still just one light behind it, even though these colors look different. And you can imagine if those colors had consciousness, that one would say, hey, look at me. I'm better than you. My color is better than yours. You're blue. I'm red. Of course, the light does not demonstrate consciousness like that. But the separation, the expression of the different colors, is simply the way that the one light expresses itself. And they cannot be against one another. They cannot pick on one another. They are simply all part of the one. If we took a black curtain and held it and closed off the sunlight from the room, and then we took a pin and we put holes in that curtain, we would have many little dots of light on the floor, but they are all part of the one light, and that one light doesn't know that those dots are not part of itself. It is the perfect unity. It is the perfect whole. It already exists. So we have to say to ourselves, well, if it already exists, then why is our experience here on this planet Earth less than that perfect peace, less than that perfect peace? And the reason for that is the human consciousness. The reason for that is what we as human beings believe. So we talk about the development of the intellect, and we talk about the development of what I will say is the intellect's creation, the ego. So the intellect is constantly analyzing, constantly dividing, constantly trying to identify, constantly trying to put things in pigeonholes. See? It's this, it's not that. It goes over here. We file it over there. And the intellect, excuse me, there goes my throat again. Let me get a drink of water. Lori gave me a cough drop today. I'm going to put it in my mouth and try to hold it there while I'm talking. So the intellect seems to be, it seems to be trying to categorize things, to identify things. It tries to find out what is different about things. And that's important for evolution. It's important as life was evolving. It was important that we kind of have ideas of what things were were useful, what things were helpful, what things were safe, and what things were unsafe. See? But remember, it is constantly trying to find out what is different, not as what the same. It is constantly trying to find out what is different. And you can see this in the media. You can see this in the news. You can see this at the break room at work. Somebody will say something, and somebody else will immediately begin to tell you what's wrong with that. You know what's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that. Here's what's wrong with that. And in human society and in human culture, it seems that if we can identify what's wrong with something, we appear to be very smart. So Osho tells us, if you want to appear to be the smartest person in the world, just disagree with everything anybody says. No, that's not true. No, that's crazy. Because people just walk away and never come back and say, well, what do you mean that's crazy? Can you explain yourself? Well, it's just dumb. It's just dumb. I can't imagine why anybody would believe that. And we never seem to get past that sort of superficial. So the intellect is always trying to divide things. It's always trying to analyze things. And there's a time and a place for that and a purpose for that. But it is not the be-all and the end-all. And that's why I say the idea of the peace that passes understanding is beyond the intellect. Because if I say, well, there's a peace that passes understanding, the intellect's immediately going to start to say, well, is that like the armistice at the end of the war? Is that like this? Is it like that? Or it's not like this, or it's not like that, or that idea will never work. And I'll tell you why that idea will never work. Because those people over there, they're not peaceful people, you see. And immediately the intellect takes something that is whole and tries to slice it into pieces. Now, the intellect is a very important part of our being. It's a very important thing for our life. But there comes a point where it can't experience the peace that passes understanding. Remember, we talk about what walking the razor's edge means. We use the intellect to help us understand that there's a place where the intellect can't go. So at some point we have to go there and leave the intellect behind. And if we try to take the intellect with us to analyze things for us, we have lost. We have lost our purpose. This is why we learn how to meditate. This is why we learn how to not become entangled with our thoughts. We learn to have the experience without the rational processes. We learn to have the experience without trying to make it a problem to be solved or reasoned out or any of those things. Now, the other thing that we're talking about is the ego, which the ego is a collection of ideas, right? So the intellect analyzes things and forms opinions about the way they are and they ought to be. And then the ego is the intellect's collection of ideas about who we are and the way things ought to be in our lives. So we have this idea, nothing more than an idea, mind you. We have this idea of who we are and the way things ought to be. And we believe it's right, and we believe we need to defend it. So in my experience, the way the ego behaves is it thinks that if something comes up that is in opposition to what it believes to be true, then that is a threat that needs to be put down. Now we're talking emotion. We're not talking even rational. It's just, this comes up, it's not what I believe, therefore it's wrong, it needs to be put down. Look at the news. Look at the news. What do you see on the news? That's not right, that's terrible, that's not our way, that needs to be put down. It's all ego. It's all egotistical stuff. So part of that self-identity that we have, part of this this concept of who I am, is an idea of separation, is an idea of apartness. It is not an idea of unity. It is an idea of multiplicity. We don't see that the multiplicity is the unity expressing itself as multiplicity. And I find a very helpful analogy to help us kind of get our mind around that is the ocean and the wave. Now, how many oceans are there on the planet? And typically, we might start counting and say, well, there's 7. Oh, no, now they added the Southern Ocean, and now there's 8. And so you got Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian, and Mediterranean, and all these things. There's only one ocean. The name of the ocean depends upon where we're standing or where we're looking at the time. Excuse me. So in America, if we were in New York and we look out at the water, we say that's the Atlantic. If we're in San Francisco, we look out the water and we say that's the Pacific. But if we're looking at that beautiful picture of the blue marble that was taken from the moon during the Apollo missions, there's just one ocean. There's just one ocean. It in itself is not divided. And on that ocean there are many waves. But those waves are each a part of that ocean. An individualized expression of the ocean. That's what the waves are. The ocean waving at us. That's what the waves are. But they come from the ocean, they go back into the ocean. Everything that they are is part of the ocean. They are not the entire ocean, but they are an expression of the ocean. So you can imagine if the waves had an ego, and the waves would be saying, hey, look at me. I'm taller than you are. I'm moving faster than you are. I'm better than you are. And I'm not the same as you. I'm different than you are. And the wave might even not even recognize that it is part of the ocean. The ocean is just there to support it as far as it is concerned. So kind of when we go through life then, this idea that I am separate from that which has created me out of itself, and I am separated from the other creations of that self, this is an egotistical idea that, again, served purpose during physical evolution, but serves us no purpose as we grow spiritually. The only purpose that it serves is to keep us separate, and again, we cannot experience the peace that passes understanding. The peace with your spirit, not with your intellect, not with your ego, but the peace that is with your spirit. So we have an understanding a little bit about what the kind of peace that we're talking about is, right? This experience of unity, this experience of love, this experience of harmony, this experience of oneness, this experience of God is what we're talking about. He who knows not God, knows not love, and perfect love casts out fear. And if you think of all of the things in this world today that we are experiencing that are not peaceful, fear and greed are probably the two primary drivers behind them. What would this world look like if we didn't have fear, if we didn't have greed? What would it look like? I often wonder what your Facebook feed would look like during the day if people weren't afraid. I don't know how yours is, but mine goes back and forth all day. For this, against that, for this, against that, and then later in the day it's just completely the opposite, a different group of people. But much of it seems to be driven by fear, and part of that fear is a fear that I will not get my fair share, or I will not get my good. Somebody else is going to take a piece of my pie. So these are the ideas that the human consciousness has that gets in the way and are in opposition to the fact that there is only one life, there's only one God, there's only one everything, and we are all part of it. So now we kind of get into this question of, well, we have an idea of what this peace is, we have an idea of what the obstacles in our own consciousness are to experiencing this peace, and then we have to get into, what can I do about it? What can I do about it? So again, the human idea of peace is what I can do about it is I can make everyone else conform to what I want. I can build up a big army so that they'll do what I want them to do. I can go into battle with them so they will do what I want to do. I can rise to some position of political power so that then I can have my will imposed upon everybody else in the country, and then when that happens, I will be happy and I will be peaceful. And the human ego goes off to turn this into a conflict and a project. And you can't fight your way to peace, right? I worked with a man years ago who said you can't borrow your way out of debt. That was one of his favorite sayings. You can't borrow your way out of debt. Pay cash for everything because you can't borrow your way out of debt. Well, you can't fight your way to peace. You can't. Because the peace is not dependent upon something out there. The peace is an inner way of experiencing life. An inner way of being. There's more to peace than the absence of war. Spinoza. It is a way of being. A way of being. And as Gandhi said, we must become the change we wish to see in the world. So I think it's fair to say that we all would like to see a more peaceful world. Well, how do we see a more peaceful world? By becoming more peaceful ourselves. And this kind of sticks right in our craw, because we say, but what about those people over there? How can I be peaceful as long as those people over there are doing this, that, and the other thing? And we have to come to understand that peace is not dependent, our experience of peace is not dependent on their behavior, even if their behavior is against us, even if their behavior would tend to hurt us in some way. That's not saying that we surrender ourselves to abuse and let people hurt us. Of course, society has to protect itself from the people who would do evil, but we don't have to hate them. See, we don't have to work ourselves up into a frenzy of dehumanizing them. We can still understand that they are human beings, that what they're doing makes sense to them in some way, and it's not a peaceful way. But that's because they're not peaceful people. And I can't teach people who are not peaceful how to be peaceful if I'm not peaceful myself. So the best thing that I can do to bring about this change of peace in the world is to become more peaceful myself. And the way that I do that then is my life becomes my spiritual practice. I try to catch myself at all of those times where I am believing in separation, where I am fearful, where I am angry, where I am less than kind in my thoughts. And I need to stop right there and say, wait a minute, this is an opportunity for me to grow. This is an opportunity for me to move beyond that. In Buddhism, there's part of their teaching that says, if someone makes you angry, you should thank them, because they have shown you an area that you're ready to grow through, that you're ready to work through. So in this regard, then, every day becomes an opportunity. Every moment of every day is an opportunity to catch ourselves when we are less than peaceful, and to stop right then and remind ourselves that God is all there is. I will not be fooled by appearances. I will judge by the righteous judgment. All these different things that spiritual teachers have told us. Is it possible, like Daniel in the lion's den, to be in the midst of all this craziness and still be centered in God? Shadrach in the furnace, still be centered in God. Still be centered in God. There's a story that I know I've told before about the Dalai Lama who was talking to one of his monks who had been in prison for like 25 years after Tibet was invaded. And he had been through horrible things in prison. And the Dalai Lama asked him, he says, were you ever afraid? And the man said, yes, I was. I was afraid. And the Dalai Lama said to him, what were you afraid of? And the man said, I was afraid that I might come to hate my captors. He was so committed to his spiritual growth that he understood that no matter what they were doing to him, if his response was hate, it would be worse than what they were doing to him physically, mentally, emotionally. He could not hate. Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning determined in Auschwitz that nobody could take away his right to be happy. What we have to do is we have to come to realize that there is only one person in charge of our consciousness, and that is us. And we are not victims, see. We are not victims of what happens out there. So much of the anger, so much of the hate, so much of the greed, so much of the unrest in the world is rooted in a belief of victimhood. And if we get up and say, well, I can't help but react and respond any other way because of what somebody did, we are declaring ourselves to be a victim. So what we want to do is to catch ourselves in that moment, lovingly, right? Don't try to beat ourselves down and say, oh my goodness, look at that. Look at that. Look at what just passed through my field of consciousness and I bought into. That's not my truth. That's not my truth. There's only one. There's only God. In Buddhism, we're given the concept of unconditional love. In Christianity, it's called agape love. And in Buddhism, we're kind of given the example of a mother's love for its only child. A mother's love for its only child. I want you to think about a mother's love for its only child. Is there anything that the child could do that would stop the mother from loving it? No matter how badly it misbehaved. She wouldn't appreciate the behavior, she wouldn't tolerate the behavior. But she wouldn't stop loving that child. She would continue to love it forever. I saw a documentary about prisons in North Carolina. We had a prison ministry some 30 years ago, I guess, pretty close to that. And I was interested in those things. And there was this documentary about prison life in North Carolina, and they were interviewing this one man who was serving out a life term down at the prison farm in Caledonia in the eastern part of the state. And he said, they asked him, he said, what's your biggest regret about being here? And he said, well, he says, I committed the crime for which I was convicted, he said. So I understand that as far as punishment goes, I deserve to be here. He says, I'm not complaining about that. I did it, and I understand my punishment, and I accept that. He says, the biggest regret I have is that I didn't realize that when you go to prison, you take your mother with you. He said, after a few years, my wife divorced me so she could move on with her life, and I understand that. He said, after a few more years, my kids stopped sending me birthday cards and Father's Day cards, and they moved on with their lives, and I can understand that. He said, but every year since I've been in here, I think he'd been in prison for almost 30 years then. He said, every year since I've been in here, I get a birthday card from my mother. She's never been able to move on. She's never forgotten me. A mother's unconditional love for its only child. We have to first learn to love ourselves that way. Then we have to learn to love each other, those who are close to us, that way. And then we must extend that love to each and every other person, even those who would wish to do us harm. We don't have to love the behavior, but we must find that experience of unity. We must never let ourselves give that away. We are the only ones in charge of our consciousness. We are the only ones who can do that. We need to spend time in our spiritual practice so that we can learn to detach ourselves from our thoughts and emotions and not react and respond to each and everything that pops into our field of awareness. We must learn to see the unpeaceful thoughts as they arise and stop them right where they are. Oh, look, an angry thought. Oh, look, a hateful thought. Oh, look, a fearful thought. And as we do that, we take the steam out of them. As we do that, we are able to bring ourselves into the experience of the peace that passes understanding. As we go into 2020, I invite each and every one of us to make the experience of peace a priority in our lives. When you get up in the morning, don't turn on the news the first thing. They're going to tell you what to be angry about and fearful about. Sit in your spiritual practice. Know that none of it is the ultimate truth. And then go into your day as peace. And so it is.